good morning. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you all here today. So I'll let Mereda introduce herself, but so glad you all could come out on this beautiful Saturday morning. So we'll let Mereda talk for a little bit and read and then ask questions. Does that sound good? Yep. Okay. All right.
So I would love if we could get started with kind of giving me an idea of who's here. So like if you've read at least one of my books, you raise your hand. Okay. If you have never heard of me before this event, okay. So I'm going to assume if you didn't raise your hand, you either just don't like raising your hand at things like this, or you've heard of me, maybe you know of me, but you've never gotten around to reading one of my books. So as she said, my name is Mereda Hart Farynyk. I am a Charlotte native. It's actually very fun to be here specifically because my husband and I, when we were dating, we had weekly study dates at this library way back in the day. And when I say study dates, I mean that he studied and I wrote. I actually have vivid memories of specific poems that I wrote in this library, so it's kind of fun. I wrote or read or mostly just distracted him incessantly, if we're being honest. But yeah, so lived in Charlotte my whole life, and then with the exception of when I was in college, I went to university at UNC Chapel Hill, where I majored in dramatic arts, which is just a fancy way of saying acting, and creative writing was my minor. The kind of funny thing about that is that like acting was always the plan. From the time I was 10 years old and played Lucy in a local production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I knew I wanted to be an actress, and that was like, growing up I had many loves. Like I loved dancing, and I was in dance classes from the time I was little. I was always into singing, and I was in choirs and ensembles and a bunch of like a musical theater and stuff, and I loved writing. I was always writing lots of beginnings of things, lots of beginnings of stories that never really went anywhere, but I wrote short stories as well, and but acting was my thing. So when I went to college, I knew I wanted to major in acting, but the plan was to minor in something practical that could actually make me money. So when my mom suggested that I minor in creative writing, I was a bit taken aback because that didn't really go with the plan. But she said something to me that I will never forget. It was very impactful. She's like, you know, if it came to it, I think that you could give up acting. Like it would be hard, it would be very painful, but I don't think you could ever stop writing. It's just too much of who you are. Which very much surprised me at the time, because I was very much like, as I said, all about acting. I had growing up, it was always like watching the Academy Awards, and I always envisioned being the first person to ever win Best Actress. And then I got too old to do that, and I was still like, well, I'm going to be the second youngest person. And I loved getting into different characters and seeing the world through their eyes and like feeling their feelings and thinking their thoughts and taking on their mannerisms. And I loved the way being on stage with somebody else and having their mannerisms affect mine. And that whole process of just really like coming to see the world through all these different eyes. So yeah, acting always the plan, but I did end up minoring in creative writing because of what my mom said. Looking back, I do understand why she said that, because not only did I write, little stories and stuff, I also wrote incessantly in my journals. And I would write in my journals, and then I would go to my mom and read her sections of what I had written in my journals, because that's a perfectly normal thing to do. But it was so I not only had this desire to write and express myself that way, but I had a desire to share what I had written with other people. And I was always, reading things to my mom and to my friends too. I had certain friends that we would like go to each other's houses and read journal entries to each other. So I did that. Still, by the time I graduated from college, I was still focused on acting. This maybe like writing had been thrown in there into the vision as well. Like I would be a really famous actress, and then I would write a book, and then I would star in the movie that the book was inspired. But still, acting was the main thing. My plan was to come home and work through the summer at the job that I had worked since high school, and then move across the country to LA to really try to make a career in film. But during that summer, my now husband, right here, asked me out
and I did not go to LA. Ended up staying here, getting married, and at that point I decided I really didn't want to pursue acting anymore, at least for the time being. It just didn't really fit into what I wanted our life to look like at that point. So then I found myself in difficulty because not only did I have this huge hole of creative energy, I'm a person who feels an enormous burden of wanting to do something that matters and wanting to use my time and use my gifts in a way that feels meaningful. So I was working at the time, but it wasn't something that I was excited about. And so at that point I decided, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna actually write my first book. And I did. It took me over 2 years to get a first draft out, but I started writing. My brother made a joke one night at a rehearsal dinner for a friend's wedding and gave me an idea for a book, and I wrote it. There were a lot of things that made it take a really long time. One was just, life is busy. I was working. I was very focused on being newly married. But also I had, though my creative writing experience at Chapel Hill was, most of my classes were like neutral to positive. There was one that was very negative. I had a professor who hated he kind of hated everything everyone wrote. It wasn't just me, but I do think he had a particular thing with me. He kept saying that my writing wasn't edgy enough. And at one point he told me that I needed to go out over the weekend and steal something or something to make my writing more relevant. I'm like, okay. So we didn't see eye to eye. But at the same time, even though I knew that it was that simple, at the same time, it did kind of steal the joy out of writing for a little bit, because I would every week go in and it was just like everything was negative all the time, and I don't respond well to that. So there was a little bit of that, but there's also it was mostly just me getting in my own way of, one thing is my whole life I had been told, like, if you're gonna write a good book, you have to start with a very thorough outline. You have to have like all these character diagrams and answer all these questions about like, what does he like, tea or coffee better, and what is his favorite color, and like all of these things. And it never made sense to me. It never clicked to write a story that way. Because I was like, well, I don't know until I write it. Like, I don't know the answer to these questions until I write it. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis, from one of my favorites of his books, that says, I happen to believe that you can't study men, you can only get to know them, which is quite a different thing. Mm-hmm. And I always think of that when I think of how I create characters, because it's like, I don't know them until I spend time with them. Like the same as with a person. Like until I actually like watch what they do and go through life with them in the story, that's when I start to know all those answers. So I finally decided, okay, I'm not going to worry about the outline thing, but at the same time, there was this concern of, well, if I don't have an outline, there's always the possibility that it won't actually work as a story, and it will kind of unravel and it won't go anywhere, or just be dumb, or, you know, or. And I was always stopping to self-edit before I continued and wanting to pick apart every other thing. I also think there's this tendency, not that everyone's like this, but with young writers, that you have this feeling of like, if I'm going to spend all this time on this project, it has to come out as like the next great American novel, right? It's like an enormous amount of pressure to put, because we know that that's possible, right? It's possible to knock it out of the park on your first try. But mostly that's not how life works, right? Like first time you do something is not going to be amazing. So there was a lot of pressure I kept putting on it and kept getting away, but finally I did get out a first draft. And then I wanted to get it published. I wanted to share what I had written. At that point, I had zero interest in self-publishing. I was very, I think I didn't read books that were self-published typically, and so I thought, well, if I don't read them, then why would I expect other people to read them? And so I tried to get an agent, because that's the first step to, traditional publishing. And I did get a little bit of interest from an agent who was considering working with me, but that ended up not going anywhere. And during that time, I continued to write other things. It came to a point 2 years after I finished that first draft, where I just really was tired of people not being able to read it. I kept having friends and family, like they knew that I had written a book, and they would ask how they could read it. And I'm like, well, it's just sitting on my computer right now. There isn't a way that you can read it. So finally I decided, and I wasn't trying to get an agent all that time. A lot of the time I was working on edits and stuff. So I wasn't trying for 2 years. I don't remember how long I did try, but I got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm going to publish it on Amazon, but it still wasn't like a real publish in my mind. And also at that point, Amazon only had the option of Kindle publishing, like so for ebooks. Now they have paperback, they have hardcover. They actually started beta testing where AIs read your audiobook for you. And there's like all these different voices you can choose from. And my son and I have been playing with my books, and some of my names are pronounced very interestingly. You can adjust the pronunciation, but it doesn't always work. But I've been playing with that. I may have an audiobook come out soon. We'll see. But yeah, back then it was just for Kindle. So in my mind, I was like, I'm just going to put this on there so that if somebody asks, I can say, oh, here, if you want to read it, this is a way to read it. But, and not to say I didn't try to do a good job publishing. I did. I got a beautiful watercolor cover art for it. Where is it? Here. This is my first book. And I love this. So I had an artist friend paint this for me. I tried to do what I could to learn formatting stuff. So I tried to make it nice, but at the same time, I was like, this is not real. I'm going to publish the weird way. But a couple things happened when I did that. I published it, and for one thing, I was kind of surprised by the reaction to it, by how much enthusiasm there was for the story. And it was the first of a trilogy, so there was lots of people who were very excited about the second one. And I think when I published it, I remember telling my boss that I published the book, and I was like, my goal is to sell 10, like total, period. If I sell 10 copies of it, then I'll be okay. And I sold more than 10 in the first day. So I think I had very low expectation for what was going to happen. And still though, I was still continuing to try to get an agent. I was writing different books and trying to get agents for those. But while I was trying to get agents for those, I kind of kept publishing. And then I got to this time that I call the golden age of my writing, where I was in a place in life where I was able to just like write and write and write. I had one baby, but it was just one baby who was pretty chill in a lot of ways. And I had 1 year where I wrote 7 books in a year. I would be writing books. I wrote one book in 6 days. This one took me 6 days to write. This one, which is one of my longest books, not my longest, but one of my longest books, took me 15 days to write. I had a couple that took me 11 days to write. So I was just writing, and I was starting to write all different kinds of things, all these different genres. And I kind of and during that time, I just stopped even trying to get an agent or trying to get a publisher, because I was having so much fun just writing and just exploring all the different things that came and just having fun with it. And not being restrained by a publisher. I realize more and more, I see a lot of authors say things of like, oh, I really wanted to write a sequel to this book, but my publisher wanted me to go in a different direction. And I always thought that was so sad, to not be able to write what you really wanted to write, or the stories that you had coming to you. And I was always so surprised by the different things that came. So, and then I got to a point where life made me slow down. My son got older, and I started homeschooling him more, and I had another child, so life got a little busier. I wasn't able to write nearly as much, and so I was able to think about it and reassess it, and I decided I really didn't want a lot of things that come with traditional publishing. There are a lot of nice things about it in terms of having all the money behind you and marketing, and but there are so many things about it that I realized that I love the freedom of being able to just do it the way I do it. At this point, I create most of my cover art. It's like I do it all myself, and it's a lot of fun. So that's that's where I am. And then in terms of what kinds of books I write, I have a lot. I have published 22 books. 21 of them are in printed form. There's one that's only an ebook version. And I have 2 main questions that people ask me when they find out I'm an author, if they're interested to hear more. And both of the answers to those make me a marketer's nightmare because they're always very convoluted, and I've tried to be more concise in how I answer these questions. But the first question is, what kinds of books do you write? For the sake of today, I'm going to try to answer simply. I'm always like, well, but this one's kind of this and this. And there are endless categories in my mind, but I've tried to simplify it to 4 main categories, most of the books falling into 2 of those categories. Sorry, he's so cute. So the main category that my books are in is fantasy fairy tale, falling into that. Some of them are much more traditional fairy tales. Even within that, though, there's quite a range. I have some very light-hearted fairy tales. I have some like darker, grimmer fairy tales. They are original fairy tales. They're not retellings. They have a lot of themes that you'd be familiar with from traditional stories, but they are like original fairy tales. Some of them are more traditional fantasy. This is my Fire Dark series, which is more of a typical fantasy in certain ways. Typical, I don't know if any of my books are typical of anything, but, and then I have some that have some mythological elements to them. Some have references to Greek mythology and such. With those books, with my fantasy books, there's a lot of allegory, there's a lot of spiritual imagery, there's a lot of like real life parallels. And there's another quote, one of my favorite quotes is, fantasy is hardly an escape from reality, it's a way of understanding it. And it's by Lloyd Alexander, and I've always loved that quote, because that's very much how I feel. Like if I read a fantasy book or a fairy tale and I don't feel like I came to see something very true about life through it, or I learned something about life through it, then I am not interested in it. I don't like fantasy books that feel like they're just kind of wish fulfillment or, escapism. I wanted to tell me something true, something real. So that's the first category. The second category is one that I have come to call historically inspired fiction. It is not historical fiction. It's also not fantasy or fairy tales. There's nothing fantastical in it. It could be real life, but it's not. So I have one like this book, The Light Through Ancient Trees, is inspired by, I'm very into East Asian TV shows. So like Chinese, Taiwanese. At this point, I'm into K-dramas as well, Korean dramas. But when I wrote this book, I was still I just knew the Chinese, Taiwanese ones. And so this book was kind of inspired by ancient China, Taiwan. It is definitely not set in ancient China, Taiwan. It's purely fictional. But what happens is I will be inspired by some flavor or some idea, and I do a lot of research on that place and around that time. I'll look up, what kind of furniture did they have, and what kind of makeup did they use, and what was their clothing, and how did they do laundry was something I researched. How did they make ink? Like I do a lot of research, and then some of those things make it in the book, and some of them don't. So then the book itself, political structure, it's definitely not meant to actually be China. It's purely fictional. And so that's a lot. Like I have another one, I call it my Aladdin-y book, The King's Bride. It has kind of Arabian Nights kind of vibe. I've had somebody compare it to the story of Esther in the Bible. It's kind of got that kind of Middle Eastern-y. I have another one. I call this my Roman Empire book. Yet again, not at all set in the Roman Empire, but that's what was in my mind as I was writing it. And it is an empire. So that's the second category. I have one that's like late 1930s English village. So that's a completely different feel. And it even references like some real things, but it never mentions England. It really could be anywhere in a lot of ways. So the next category, there's only 3 books. My first trilogy, the Hyacinth trilogy, is a dystopian trilogy. So Hyacinth, the average girl, Hyacinth, the new recruit, and Hyacinth, the coming dawn. And then the last category, there's only one book that really fits in this category, but there's another one that I sneak into it and pretend that it fits, is just contemporary real life. My novella, the one that is not in printed form, it's in an ebook, is set at Chapel Hill and Charlotte dominantly. It's kind of a stream of consciousness. It's just thinking about life mostly. I mean, there is a story, but it's just real life contemporary. The other one that kind of fits in this category is I have a murder mystery. Where is it? Oh, right here.
When Memory Lies, and it feels like normal life. There's social media, there's texting, and it's obviously meant to be set in the U.S. The actual city it's set in is never named. So it's kind of like my other ones where I'm vague about the details, but it feels like normal life. There is a little bit of a sci-fi element to that one, which makes it not quite fit into the just real life thing. But it's a sci-fi element that I kind of feel is probably not that far-fetched. So anyway, so that's my books. Quite a lot of flavors. As I said, some are much more lighthearted, some are much grimmer. But there are a lot of things that you will find in all of them. One thing is that I am very, very character focused. I'm fascinated by why do people do what they do? Why do they feel what they feel and think what they think? Character interactions. My husband often says that my books are very relational. There's lots of people talking to each other, lots of dialogue, I guess, from my theater days. Lots of dialogue, lots of, the character development, relationship development, and yet peeling back the layers of looking at people's motivations and hearts. Sometimes I think they can be kind of uncomfortable for that reason. Because some of my books do this more than others, but some of them can be pretty intense in the getting to the heart of a motivation, and sometimes our motivations are not that great. So it can be not always the most pleasant experience, I think. But that's a big thing, character stuff. Another thing is ideas. Philosophy, theology, thinking about spirituality. My books do that a lot. So a lot of the conversations that the characters have are about ideas. And then the last thing would be like uncovering some mystery or trying to get at the heart of some truth. But a huge thing that I love to do is to look at something, be it a behavior or a thought or a feeling or belief, and try to get at the root of it. Like, what was the initial seed? What was it? Where did this idea come from? Or where did this belief come from? Or this feeling that somebody has? Where did it come from? And then doing the opposite of like, if left to itself, where will it ultimately lead? What is the end of this belief? So I'm gonna read from a review somebody wrote of the Ballad of Andronicus and Sylvain, which is my most recent book that I've published. She said, another thing I always appreciate about Mereda's writing is that she has a way of creating such an evil villain steeped in maddening injustice, and also writing the story in such a way that her other characters journey through discoveries that they are just as capable of the same injustice if they're not careful and purposeful. And I was so complimented by reading this, because that's a very much like, my books are meant to be sobering in a lot of ways, like making my villains very human in the sense of some of my villains don't even really seem like villains in certain ways, because they feel so justified. And I think that's the thing, is we can all feel very justified in looking at the truth of why we're doing what we're doing. And so I don't know, how long have we been going? Okay. So that's those are like kind of the big things that will run through all my books. Is they're very character focused. They're very into kind of exploring those ideas. The next main question that people ask me after they ask what kind of books I write, and I try to stumble through some kind of answer that's somewhat cohesive, is what age do you write for? And I'm just as bad at answering that question, because I don't. So writing 101, you take writing classes and they're like, know your audience. I even had writing classes where they said, like, think of a specific person you know and think about that person while you're writing, like write for that person. And I don't do that at all. I write the story that I think needs to be told. I don't think about who it's for. Now, not that I don't care about who's reading it, of course. When I'm doing edits, I definitely try to make things understandable. I try to communicate. I think about different types of people who might read it and try to communicate to those people. I definitely care about the reader, but when I'm initially writing the story, I just want to be true to the story. So I don't ever have a particular age in mind. I will say that I love all of them, and I'm an adult, so I tend to think of my books as books for adults. That said, I have some books that are much more youthful in tone. The characters are quite young, and some of the themes are younger. I have some of my books that are more definitely like mature themes. I wouldn't think of a younger teen like reading them. They could, probably, but they're more those older themes. But then again, one of my books that I would put in the definitely adult category is simply because the main characters are in their 30s. But my 14-year-old niece has told me that it's one of her absolute favorites of my books. So it's I've had readers as young as 10 and as old as in their 90s and everywhere in between. I've had men and women read them. Actually, I just lied. I said as young as 10, but I have an update to that. My son wanted me to tell y'all. So my 7-year-old, I just wrote a book, and I'm hoping to publish it in the next few months. And I wrote it, and he begged me to read it to him. This is before I had done any edits on it or anything. And I read the beginning of it to him, and actually, of all my books, I was like, this one is one that actually might work for a 7-year-old. Because some of my books I would not read to him at this juncture because of what's in them and stuff. So I started reading it, and then the next day he asked me to read more, and within a few days we had read the entire book. He's very excited. He's very proud of this. And it was so great. The next morning, he came downstairs to breakfast, and he's like, you know, I was thinking about that story. And he goes on to tell me all of these like real life parallels that he had noticed in the story. It's my dream. So yeah, so now I have a younger range. My range is from 7 to in their 90s. Because of Fieka. But so that's my books. That's as I said, ages I don't know. But now I think I'm going to go ahead and do some readings from a few different books to try to maybe illustrate some of what I've been rambling about. The first book I'm going to read from is The King's Bride. This is my Aladdin-y book, as I said. It's really not like Aladdin at all in a lot of ways, but in terms of the setting. So this is one of my non-fantasy ones. It is the story of Zishtari, who is an orphan on the street until one day the king sees her and wants her to be part of his harem, wants her to be one of his many wives. When the story starts, she has been living in the harem for a number of years, but she has not yet married the king. She's about to do so and is determined to escape before that happens. For the festivities, lots of people have been invited to come to the royal city, and one of them is Lord Ashid, who has discovered her plan to escape. At this point, they have had a number of interactions. Also, one of the main themes of this book is the concept of freedom. Like, what is true freedom? How do we attain it? Like, what does that look like? And this is a bit of a conversation between Ashid and Zishtari about that concept. You know what it is to be hungry, he obliged, to be cold, to be stuck out in a sandstorm and in the rain, and yet you wish to escape the comfort of the harem. Why did he care? I do, I said. Why? My lips were parted, but for a moment no sound came from them. And then, for freedom. I closed my mouth, swallowing. Do not wish to be owned. I do not wish to forever bow to the will of another. I want to be free to rule my own life. In truth, I would rather be hungry every day than to have a life of jewels and full stomachs and be a slave. The way Ashid was watching me continued to rankle. He looked almost sad. What? I snapped again. I do not think that kind of freedom exists. I shook my head. What do you mean? I do not think that any man rules his own life. I think that every man serves one master or another. For me, it is not a matter of whether or not I serve a master. It is a matter of whether or not the master I serve is good. I pushed out a derisive breath. Is any man good? Nay. His response was so immediate, so sure, which is why I do not serve man, but God. That is true freedom, serving a master who is always good. But why serve a master at all? I couldn't stop myself from asking. His comment that no man ruled his own life had not been explained. Why do you not simply serve yourself? His eyes came slowly to me. Have we not just said? He murmured. No man is good. You of all people know that I am no exception. His admission shook me. Was he truly saying that he trusted this God of his more than he trusted himself? And then he said it. I would rather serve a God who is good than myself who is not.
Next we have There Were Dragons. This is one of my personal favorites. It is a fantasy. It's a portal fantasy, so it's fantasy, but it also has some kind of fairy tale elements to it. But my protagonist is a 17-year-old from the American South who goes through a cave and ends up in a fantastical world. She's immediately met with crazy creatures and different people who have very definite ideas of what she's doing there and what she's supposed to do. She has no interest in taking part in their plans for her. She's been there for a day. It's now nighttime, and she has found the cave that she came through, and she's going to go back home through the cave. Finally, I decided that showing up in the middle of the world, showing up in my world in the middle of the night was preferable to having those three stare me down. So I turned around and plunged into the cave. I felt my lungs tighten as I took a few steps and let the darkness close around me. When I was little, I was scared of the dark. I mean, really scared, terrified. I would lie in bed at night and cry and call for Mom and Pa to come upstairs to my room. I could never get out of bed to go get them because I was too scared of what would happen if I left the protection of my covers. I didn't know what it was I was so afraid of. Not ghosts, I knew those weren't real. Not monsters or kidnappers or anything that concrete. It was something intangible. I guess it was the darkness itself. Or maybe that was the problem. It was that the darkness didn't seem intangible at all. It seemed to have arms and teeth and icy hands that could reach out and smother me. I'd gotten over that years ago, but every so often something would cause it to resurface, like that bully at school you thought was expelled but was really just suspended. And in the blink of an eye, I'd be that little girl again, shaking with fear, running to switch on the nearest light as fast as my feet would take me. But there was no light in that cave to switch on. It was just black. And the longer I walked, the more I wanted to turn around and run back to the light of the Fairwood and the already oddly familiar people there. But I didn't turn back. I kept walking and walking and walking, and it kept getting colder and wetter and darker, and I knew that something was wrong. It had to be. I hadn't walked nearly that long coming from the other side. All the same, at that point, I was so desperate to get home, and I'd gone so far that I figured that I had to be closer to home than I was to the Fairwoods, so I kept going. But then I ran into a hard dirt wall. I felt in front of me, scrambling to find an opening. I must have turned the wrong way or something. But when I finally found one, it was small and low to the ground. No way, no how was I getting on my belly to crawl through a cave tunnel. And that was when I completely lost it. To be honest with you, I don't think you want to hear about the panic attack I had in that cave. And to be even more honest with you, I don't particularly want to relive it. Suffice it to say, it wasn't pretty. As far as what I actually did next, I didn't cry or anything like that. I mostly just started breathing way too fast and turned around and ran back in the direction I'd come from. And ran and tripped a few times and ran. I was still wearing that long silk dress and I wasn't wearing any shoes. I stubbed my toes a few times. Isn't it crazy how much that hurts? And I sliced my foot open on a sharp rock. But at long last, I saw the glow of the moonlit wood. By the time I broke out of the cave and into the forest, Corliss and the fair were gone, which was no surprise. I've been in the cave a long time. And though the light there was as bright as day when compared to the darkness of the cave, I suddenly felt that it too was too dark. I knew that if I found Keely's tree, she would have candles and those purpley blue lights, but I didn't want to deal with Keely. I didn't want to deal with any of them. I didn't want to be in the wood of the fair any longer. Zothan had told me that I was trespassing there, and I could feel just how true that was. And so, in that frantic state of mind, in the middle of the night, stuck in another world, I did something that made very little sense. Kept on running. I knew that I was likely miles and miles from the forest edge, but I didn't care. I had to get away from those trees and the beings who were living in them. I didn't care that I was running farther from my home rather than drawing near. I didn't care about anything except to get out of there. I ran and I ran and I ran, and then the light of the moon burst all around me as my running foot came down on not earth, but air. My body began to lurch forward, and someone's arm shot around my waist from behind, encircling it and pulling me back against a tall, lean body. This was my last addition to the readings. I'm mostly doing it just because I couldn't bear not to read from this one. It is my favorite. I'm not going to say much about this setting of the scene. This is one of my fantasies. It's got a lot of references to Greek mythology and to like British folklore a bit. Mostly what I'm going to say about this scene is that the two characters in it are both in a very difficult situation at this point, and they've only very briefly met before this moment, and in this moment they are alone. Dimitrian's eyes took her in. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She was still shaking. She couldn't help it. What was wrong with her? There was no reason for her to be a quaking mess in the presence of this man. "I'm not going to touch you," Dimitrian continued as Lively pushed her small table away and doubled over onto her lap. She shook her head. "I didn't think you were going to. I'm sorry, I don't..." She took a deep breath and straightened again. There. She was better. At least, somewhat. She was able to face him now. "Why are you here?" "You said," his voice was low, "when we met before, that you were kept always alone. I came..." She waited. "I came to say hello." Lively stared. And then, as it happened in the great room 2 weeks ago, tears most abhorrently burst to her eyes. She blinked them away. How ridiculous. She had not cried in weeks. There was no use in it. When there is no hope, what is the use in crying? And yet, twice now, her eyes had become most atrociously wet in front of this slave from Canterbury. This is Looking for Atlantis. My mom likes to tease me because this is one of my most realistic books. It is not fantastical at all, and yet she said the title makes it sound like it is fantastical. It is a metaphorical title, but this is my late 1930s one. My son really wanted me to read this, so here we are. But this is, set up for this is, we have Charlotte is my protagonist. She has decided at the beginning of the summer that she is going to win the affections of her childhood crush, Gerald, with the help of her best friend, Tommy. And Tommy has set up a picnic to help them spend time together, and this is just a silly conversation. This is really just to show a very different flavor. The other things I've read have been a little more serious, I guess. This is just a silly conversation at the beginning of this picnic. I was grateful to Tommy for arranging the event and seeing to it that the partridges were there. I had been worried that he would forget and exclude them, as they didn't have anything to do with his pursuit of Lillian or my pursuit of Gerald. But I was nevertheless worried that the afternoon would be something of a repeat of the party a few nights prior. Tommy too captivated by Lillian to notice anything else, Audrey monopolizing Gerald, and yours truly trapped in tedious conversation with Morris. I became even more concerned over this eventuality when, as we were walking through the trees, Morris worked his way up beside me. "Shall I..." he began, but didn't finish. "Shall I carry that basket for you, Miss Helwick?" he politely asked. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Partridge." "Morris," I corrected, "but I can manage." "Please," he said sternly. It felt like a command, and I handed over my basket. "That's very kind of you," I said again. "Picnics are very fine, aren't they?" said Morris. "I love them," I smiled. "I don't." "Oh," I blinked. "All of the bugs and sitting on the ground and all," said he. "And the wind, and one never knows if it will suddenly rain. But people do seem to think they're very fine." "Indeed." "Why do you like them?" he inquired. "Oh, well," I faltered, somewhat perplexed by the exchange. "Some of the very things you've mentioned, I'm afraid. The wind in one's hair, getting caught in the rain, the fresh air, and the informality of lazing about on the ground. Though I do agree with you about the bugs." I'd hoped that this last comment would elicit a small smile at least, but he only nodded in somber approval. "I believe that sitting on the ground in such a way as one does for a picnic causes damage to the skeletal system if practiced often," continued Morris. "Does it?" "That is what I have read." "What is it that persuaded you to join us then?" I questioned. "At such risk to your skeletal system." "Well, I really never do it, you see, so I didn't see how it could cause too much trouble. And the girls so wanted me to come. But you ought to take care, Charlotte." I didn't dare tell him that even when I was at home with loads of chairs and sofas all around me, I could often be found lounging on the floor. "I do hope you're not often sitting on the ground," he carried on with the theme. "And one shouldn't spend too much of their time out of doors. Fresh air is pleasant for a few minutes here and there, but one should really be careful not to get too much of it. It throws off the balance of one's bodily functions. And no doubt you already know the dangers of too much sunlight." I was beginning to entertain dreary imaginings of being stuck receiving lectures from Morris all day while the others enjoyed themselves, when suddenly Gerald appeared beside us. "Do you know, I've actually read quite the opposite," said he. Morris started a little at the insertion into his address. The path was wide enough for the three of us to walk side by side there, and Gerald took advantage of that fact to capture Morris's attention. I've read that sitting on the ground is actually quite excellent for one's health, Gerald said, building muscles that would otherwise be neglected. Morris did not know what to do with this new information. Same with fresh air, continued Gerald, not about its building muscles, but about its being really exceptionally healthy. Morris continued to mutely stare. But isn't that the way with scientists and doctors, Gerald added amiably. The minute one of them says a thing is good for you, another one says it's the worst thing you could possibly do. I quite disagree with you. Morris, recovering himself, was notably austere. Science is of the utmost importance. One must never take it lightly. I said nothing against science, my good man, answered Gerald, only against scientists. I actually almost didn't do this one this morning, but my son was like, no, you have to. He thinks it's funny talking about all the bugs, of course. The last one I'm going to read from is Fire Dark. It is the first of my 5-book Fire Dark series. This is a series that is told from multiple point of views. The first book is told from 4 different ones, and the subsequent books are all told from 5 different point of views, third-person point of views. In this book, we have Sir Gabriel is known as the Fire Dark. Nobody really knows what that means, though. At a young age, he suddenly had this ability to wield fire in a magical way. But he doesn't really know why. He doesn't even know the extent of what he can do. He has, however, found a group of some others and has this little secret band of people that he's training to do similar things to what he can do. Not quite the same, but Calla is someone who has learned of this little secret band, and she wants to be trained in the fire magic. And she has traveled all the way across the kingdom to where he lives in the royal city to be taught by him. Bad luck for her, he's away when she first gets there, and but she is able to locate his secret band and ask to be a part of it. And they say, well, we can't make that decision without Gabriel here, but we will test you to see if you even have the potential to possibly be able to do this. So they test her out, something crazy happens that none of them understand. They tell her to stop and not do anything else until Gabriel gets back. Gabriel does come back. At this point, they've had a few interactions, and initially he has no interest in seeing what she can do, and is like, no, I'm not going to. At this point, he's changed his mind, and he's going to see what it is she did before that nobody understood. And so here they are, they're alone together in a clearing in the middle of the wood at night, and Calla's going to try again. Calla narrowed her eyes, but she did not say anything except, am I to begin now? Whenever you wish. She wet her dry lips. And I simply do as I did before. You were stalling. I am not, she lied. He didn't respond, and Calla set her mind to the task. She had not closed her eyes on that day with Varric and Acker and Drex. She had chosen to look at the light, to imagine that the particles were miniature flames. Now, here she was with an actual fire. It seemed only logical that looking at it and focusing on its flickers and sparks would be the best avenue for success, but something told her that it was not. Somehow she felt that the act of imagining the flames had been what had helped her before. And so, while she had been unwilling to expose herself to vulnerability by closing her eyes in the daylight with 3 of the heat vendors, she now closed them as she stood alone in the night with Gabriel. She tried to imagine the warmth in the cold night air. She tried to feel the heat that had soaked into the earth from the rays of the suns. She embraced the prickling emission of the nearby fire and imagined the twists and daggers of its flames. But just as before, she only continued to feel cold, and colder still, and colder still. Stop, Gabriel said. His hand was on Calla's wrist, and her eyes snapped sharply up to his. What? He asked, dropping his hand. She shook her head. I thought your skin would be hot to the touch. Gabriel's expression was inscrutable. I'm not actually made of fire, you know. I'm sorry. There is no need to apologize. He took a step back. You're not the first one to assume colorful things about me, and that's one of the tamest assumptions by far. Calla felt herself chastised. Gabriel said that she should not apologize, but she did not agree. Who was she to make assumptions about him? She didn't know the truth even about the Amenti Fire Dark, so she certainly did not know the truth about this man, this human Fire Dark. She had only been so blunt because he had startled her. She had been focusing on the heat, and then out of nowhere he had been touching her and telling her to stop. Stop what? What had she done? She thought of the deep cold she had felt. It was the same cold she had felt the other time she had tried, and though she knew that there was something interesting in it, she also knew that it was not the desired effect. I failed, didn't I? She asked, not wanting to hear the answer. He was looking at her with his face drawn in contemplation. Then, to her utter surprise, he let out a sigh and sat down, rather plopped down, really, onto the fallen tree. Cal remained standing for an awkward moment or two as he sat, staring into the fire. What was she meant to do? May I? She started to ask, anxious not to interrupt his ponderings, but feeling uncomfortable as she was. Ay, sit, he said impatiently. She did so, and they sat for some moments in silence. The weather was starting to change, and the mist that so commonly filled that wood were seeping into it now, creating a haze in the air, making everything appear otherworldly and unreal. You did not fail, April said at last. A faint hope buoyed Cal's heart. But you did not succeed either. The hope left. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she had a strong suspicion that he did not actually know. Instead, she said, if I did not fail and I did not succeed, what did I do? He turned to look at her, but his eyes were glazed. I don't know. So that's the last of the readings. I guess now if y'all have any questions for me, I would be more than happy to answer them. If not, I can ramble a bit more. I can always ramble more. Does anyone have any questions about, I don't know, about writing process, about the books? Yes?
When you're writing, and I'm sure you go through multiple edits, when do you know, or how do you decide when to stop editing?
Oh boy. It's a very hard question, and I have lots of agony about that question. I don't know, I don't really know how to verbalize it because it really is just a sense. I have kind of my process. I do a number of edits. And with all of my books, my mom is local, and I'll always go over to my mom's house and read my books aloud to my mom over several sessions. And then I do a few more edits based on that, and I think it just gets to a point, for one thing I've learned, there's a point where I kind of can start to over-edit, and I've started to notice the signs of that where I'm getting just really nitpicky, and it will be where I'll do an edit and I'll change a sentence to make it sound better, and then the next time I do an edit, I change it back to exactly what it was before. And when I get to that point, I'm like, okay, I'm at a point now where the story is what I want the story to be, and it's just a matter of how I feel each day as far as which one reads better. So I think when I get to that point and I kind of notice that the changes I'm making are really just cosmetic changes and they're not substantial changes, and that's when I kind of generally, I will do a little spot check and I'll kind of read the different parts, and if I read little bits of different parts and feel good about them, then I just let it go. It's always a hard thing, though. It's always hard to know. There's a quote that I like that says, art is never finished, only abandoned. And I feel that so strongly because you could always keep picking at it. You could always make it better.
You said Hyacinth was your first one. Was that all three of them, or just the first one?
I wrote Hyacinth, the first one, and then I wrote Daughter of the Rain, and then I wrote Hyacinth 2, and then I wrote How the Moon Got Her Light, and then I wrote Hyacinth 3.
So did you not know what was going to happen in Hyacinth?
Well, that's kind of true, and that's kind of not true. I had started Hyacinth 2 right after the first one, but I was still in that process of trying to get Hyacinth 1 published, and I had this kind of depression funk of well, what's the point of working on this book if nobody even likes the first one? I don't even know if people are going to like that one. No one's read it. And so during that, I wrote Daughter of the Rain. And then I got back to Hyacinth 2. So that Hyacinth 2 also took me over 2 years to write. Okay. But no, I had no idea. I had no idea where it was going.
Did that drive you crazy? Did that not drive you crazy?
It was scary. So...
Because those are my favorite.
After I wrote the second Hyacinth book, I had a very broad general idea of where it was going. After I wrote the first one, I really had no idea. And I published the first one before I finished writing the second one. Right. So it was very, I didn't know where it was going. And it was scary with that one. It has gotten less scary. So it's so funny though, because after I wrote the Hyacinth books, I was like, that's it, I'm not doing any more series. Even as a reader, I prefer standalone books. I like to be able to read a book and have the whole thing. And I always feel like God was just laughing at me because it wasn't long after that the first Fire Dark book started to come, and right away I was like, oh, I can feel this is going to be a big, long story. And yeah, that was the jokes. Not only that, but like 3 of the Farynyk books are my 3 longest books. So it's a lot. But so what I was gonna say about that, sorry, is that I started let me put it together. I started the Farynyk series, and I was at that point, Farynyk was my 10th book that I wrote. So at that point I had a lot more confidence that it would work out somehow. Not that there wasn't a lot of moments of stress throughout. And where it ended up ultimately going was a complete surprise. I was very, very surprised by where it ended up going. But I had more confidence that it would go somewhere. Like, it will happen somehow. Yes.
You ever thought about writing plays?
I have, especially in the early days when I first started. But I think at this juncture, well, and actually some of the stories that start coming, I think of them and I'm like, this makes more sense as a script. Even like the one I just wrote and read to my son, when it first came to my mind, I was like, this doesn't really feel like a book. It feels more like a screenplay. But I think one reason I haven't done that is because I don't have an easy automatic avenue for how that would be used, right? Like this, I can do it all myself. I can do all the formatting and I can make the cover art and I can like make it out there for somebody to do, but with a play, obviously, that would require a lot more people. And so I think I haven't done that because I don't know what I would do with it, but it is something that comes up in my mind for sure. Right? Yeah.
Can you give us a little teaser what this latest book is about?
Oh man, I haven't thought about how to describe it yet. I'm so bad at this, man. The back of the book blurbs that you have to write are like the bane of my existence. Oh my goodness. Okay, what I will say. So my main, it's one of my split perspective books. I have a few perspectives that go back and forth between like the main guy and the main girl. The Band of the Beast Slayer is like that. How the Moon Got Her Light is like that. Andronicus and Sylvain is like that. And this one is like that, so it goes back and forth. My main female is a creature who lives in enchanted wood, and she's all made of moss. Like her hair is moss, and she's all covered in moss. And she doesn't really have any memories at the beginning of the book. She lives her life as she has a series of steps and rules that she goes about each day, and nothing ever changes, ever. Every single day, she goes through her steps and follows the rules of the wood. And there is an ogre that lives in the wood. It's my first book with an ogre. I was so excited to use an ogre. I've never had a giant or an ogre or anything like that. I'm like, yes, it's like very traditional fairy tale. So there's an ogre of the wood that she has a like special way that she keeps safe from the ogre. And then my male protagonist is a prince. He's a king's son, to use a very like grim fairy tale wording. It's always the king's son. So he's a prince, and he and his father, the king, have been like trying to battle the wood, and he comes across her one day, and she has a mystery, and he wonders if she's kind of gonna help him in some way to defeat the wood, or so it's called Moss. That's what it's called. Which he's laughing because my son, who I keep referencing, he's become more and more involved in my storytelling process, that he was hating on this name so much. He's like, Moss? Like, what kind of a name is that? Just Moss? So on the cover, I have a fairy tale. I was like, he said that made it better, because otherwise people would just think it was like a manual about different types of moss. But yes, I'm excited about it. It's fun. It has a lot of imagery in it and stuff. As I said, my son was contemplating the parallels and the imageries, and hoping to publish that one this summer, but we'll see.
Is there romance in all your books?
It depends on how you define your terms. There is some kind of, the simple answer is yes, there is some kind of love story in all of my published books. But there are very varying degrees as to what that looks like. So some of my books, like I've even had people say, like, this really didn't have any romance in it. Some of it is really just two people getting to know each other better and like trying to uncover some mystery together. And it's really even, actually, one of my books that I thought was one of my most romantic books, and the title is like, The Ballad of Andronicus and Sylvain, and I thought it was one of my most
yeah, most romantic books. And then my husband read it, and he was like, it's really like more of a platonic friendship, isn't it? And I was like, is it? I thought there were all these like kind of tensiony moments and stuff. And but I think I do see what he means in that. I think what he said, he referenced something that happens at the end, and he's like, even when that happens, it was kind of more of like, hey, I've got your back, man, like a brothers in arms kind of thing. I'm like, well, I guess that's the height of romance to me, like that kind of like, you know, being there for each other. And but so a lot of my books are more, the relationships are more of that kind of like friendship and like trust and getting to know each other and like trying to solve some problem together. Some of them definitely do lean into the romance more. The Fight Through Ancient Trees is what I consider to be, everybody reads things differently, but what I consider to be my most romantic, like deeply romantic book. It's also the first book I wrote that was dominantly about the love story. Like this book for me is very much about like what is love, like the nature of love in general. And all my other books up until this one, there was a love story there, but the love story was not the main point. The love story was kind of there to bolster the main point and to give like power to the main point. Whereas this one, it was the other way around. There's a lot of other stuff going on. There's a lot of political stuff and danger, but that's all there to bolster the love story. So I have some form of love story. Like my murder mystery, there really isn't a love story in it, but there is a romantic interest, and there is like that topic is definitely in there, but it's just, there's not enough time for there actually to be a love story developed. Similar with the one I just wrote. There is that relationship, there's that interaction. I wouldn't really say there's a love story, but there is a relationship between a man and a woman that is significant. Whereas this one, like the whole book is her wanting to get married, and it's like very much focused on those things. So, you know. There's nothing else. I guess we can.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
There's one other thing I wanted to say. If you have any interest in like, you know, following up with me or anything, I am on Facebook, but I'm also dominantly on Instagram. If you think of any questions, you have any questions about my books or, you know, like the content of them in terms of like being appropriate for this or that or whatever, I'm very, very accessible on Instagram. I'm very active on Instagram, and my handle is Brit at Heart, so BRIT.AT.HART, my middle name. It means British at heart, and it's a play on words with my middle name. People think it means my name is Brit, and a lot of people on Instagram call me Brit. But yeah, so you can find me on Instagram or on Facebook if you want to. All of my books are available on Amazon. And I may have an audiobook come out soon. We'll see, read by an AI.
All right. The library does have all of her books in print. And then if you'd like to win a couple, I have a couple back there. There were dragons. Is that what it is?
There were dragons.
We have that one, which we may be doing for a summer book club here at the library. So keep posted on that. We'll let you know about that. We're going to do one of them. I haven't decided for sure if it's going to be that one or not. And then the other one I have back there is one of her newer ones, The Waking of the Queen.
Yes.
That one, which I love the cover for that.
I love the cover too. I've had fun. I've had fun figuring out covers.
So if you'd like to win one of those, you can put your name and phone number in there. And we just thank you all for coming out today.
Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you. All right.